Hello, this is John T. Rhapsodies Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories, bringing you another Sut Lovingood story today from 1867 called The Widow McCloud's Mare by George Washington Harris. Harris walked the earth, or as Sut would say, the yeath, from 1814 to 1869, mostly in East Tennessee. I have adapted this story to better accommodate contemporary ears. If you like stories making fun of lawyers, this one is for you. I have practiced law for 20 years and like it too. Hear the words of old. The Widow McCloud's Mare from 1867 by George Washington Harris. There come to this country once, says Sut to George Harris, a cussed, sneaking-looking reptile named Stillards. He were hatched in a crack, in the frosty rocks, where nutmegs are made out of maple, and where women paints clock faces in shoe pegs, and the men invents rat traps, man traps, and newfangled doctrines for the aid of the devil. In fact, it is the devil's garden, where he can grow what won't sprout anywhere else. Well, this critter, Stillards, looked like a cross atween a black snake and a fireman's ladder. He were 18½ hands high, and modeled like unto a shingle maker's shaving horse, and were as yellow as a warted dog with jaundice. His eyes were like unto a raccoon's, and his foot were the biggest chunk of meat and knotty bones I ever see to have no guts in it. Now if he had one gift, what would make you take to him, I never seed it. And if he ever did a good or a straight-ahead thing, I never heard of it. Stillards could perhaps be scared into acting right for a minute or two at a time, but it wouldn't last. He come among us originally as an old field schoolmaster, but he soon shed that shell and come out as oily and as slippery a lawyer as ever took a fee. Why, he'd a held his own in a pond full of eels, and swallered the last darn one of them, and then set the pond a turning a shoe peg mill. Well, Lawyer Stillards practiced on all the misfortunate devils around that circuit, till he got sassy, got rich, got 40 mollins for his nastiness, and to put a cap sheaf onto his stack of rascality, got religion and got to Congress. The first thing he did there were to proffer to plant the Capitol grounds in onions and beans, and to sell the statue of Columbus to a 10-pin alley for a sign, and the Lady Indian with him to send back the bowling balls. He even stole the Roman sword off the stone statue of War there, and fotch it to his wife for a meat chopper. Stillards practiced law unto you for anything you had, from a handful of chestnuts to a plantation. And to tell it all in a minute, when he dies, he'll make the fastest trip to the center of soot, sorrer, and smoke on record, not even excepting old Iscariot's fast time. Well, a misfortunate devil happened to steal a horse by accident, got Stillards to defend him, got into the penitentiary, and Stillards got all he had, a half-hound dog and an old 8-day Yankee clock for sending him there. He took a big young sorrel mare from a widow named McCloud for losing a land case. So he walked out into that neighborhood to gather up and tote home his fees from the widow as well as the horse thief, and I met up with him. He had the clock tied onto his back peddler fashion, leading the mare in one hand and the dog by a rope with the other. The dog were enterprising and led too fast. The mare were sulky and led too slow, and the clock were heavy and the day hot, and he were having a good time generally with his fees, his sweat, and his mean thoughts. So he commenced to trying to hire me to help him to town for a gill or only 4 ounces of whiskey. Now, who the devil ever heard tell of a gill of whiskey in these parts before? Why, it sounded sort of like an inch of cordwood or a ounce of corn shucks. It insulted me. So I sat in to fix a way to put a gill or two of personal discomfort onto his shirt, and I did it. Says I to Lawyer Stilliards, "You might save that whiskey if you does as I tell you. Just you get atop and outside that horse there, tie that dog's rope around her neck, set the time mill clock up onto her back behind you, and tie it around yourself. That makes her tote the furniture, tote you, and lead your valuable dog while you governs the movement with a good hickory switch, and them bridle strings, don't you see?" Lawyer Stilliards pouched out his mouth, nodded his head 5 or 6 times, a bending but one joint about the middle of that long yeller neck of his, and said, "Yes, a good suggestion, Mr. Lovingood." And I sat in to help him fix things. I peeled lots of good bark and twisted it for rope, set the clock on end back to back with him onto the mare's bar coupling, and I tied it around his body like I meant them to stick as long as the clock run or he lived, and it came darn nigh doing it. He said he thought the thing would work, and so did I. Well, by golly, I seed the reddish-brown fire a-playin' in the mare's eyes, and a quick twitchin' in her flank. What I knowed and understood to mean that she'd make awful things happen purty dern soon. The sharp point of Lawyer Stilliard's tailbone and the clock legs were making lively suggestions to a devil into the mare as big as a yearling. All were ready for the show to begin. "You get up, you pesky critter," said Stilliards, a-making his heels meet and crack under her belly. Well, she did get up all right, then and there, and stayed up long enough to light 20 feet further away, in a broad, trembling squat, her tail hid atween her thighs, and her ears a-dancing a-past each other like scissors a-cutting. The jolt of the running set the clock to striking. Bang, zee, bang, bang, zee, wang. Well, the mare listened powerful attentive to the first 3 licks of that clock, and they seemed to go through and through her as quick as quicksilver would get through a sifter. She waited for no more, but just ginned her whole soul up to the one job of running from under that infernal Yankee clock and his hive of bumblebees, rattlesnakes, and other awful hurtin' things, as she took it to be. I know how she felt. I've been in the same kind of fear about 500 times, and darn my carcass if she didn't carry out my ideas of getting out of trouble first rate. Every jump the mare made, she jerked that misfortunate dog 6 foot upward and 30 foot onward. Sometimes he lit on his stern, sometimes on his snout, and then onto both ends at once. That dog changed sides every other lunge, clear over Stilliards and his hour mill clock, too. He said, "Oh, ouch," every time he lit, in hound talk, of course, loud enough to scare the devil. And the road was sprinkled worm fence fashion, like unto a drunken man toting a leaky jug. The durned old clock, it got excited too, and lost control of itself, and forgot to stop, but just skizzed and wanged away straight along, and the mare a-hearing it all, and a-believing the sound to be coming closer to her innards at every pop. She thought, too, that 400 black and tan hound dogs were compassing her eternal ruin. That mare thought she seed them hounds above her, below her, behind her, afore her, and on both sides of her, everywhere and anywhere, nothing but hound dogs. And she just tried to run out of her sorrel hide. I seed her 2 hind horseshoes shining way up in the air like 2 moons. I knowed she were a-mixin' in some high-pressure vicious kickin' with a heap of as earnest and as fast a runnin' as horses ever indulges in. "Whoa, yow now," I heard, sprinkled in now and then with the yowls of the dog and the wanging of the clock, and all it outdone with the mighty noise of clattering hoofs and crashing brush. Lawyer Stilliard set humped up, his puddin' foots locked onto that scared critter's belly, and his paws wove into her mane, double-twilled. I spec she thought the devil were a-huggin' her, and she were darn near right. Thinks I, "Old feller, if you gain this suit, you may ask Saturn, when you sees him, for a pair of licenses to practice at his court. He'll sign 'em for sure." I cut across the ridge where the road wound around and got where I could see 'em comin' sorta towards me again. She were stretched out straight as a string, and so were Stilliard's. He were roostin' powerful low onto her withers, his long arms locked around her neck, his big feet a-flyin' about in the air, each side of her tail sorta limber-like, and the dog must have been nigh unto killed dead. If he yowled anyhow, I didn't hear it. That clock, the cussed mischief-making machine, the cause of all this uneathly noise, trouble, and vexation of spirit, were still unto Lawyer Stilliard's back, and a-maulin' away as if it were in the straight line of a household duty, and the bark rope were a-holdin' its powerful hold, well, considerin' the strain. Well, they met an old bald-headed, thick-set feller a-comin' from the mill, a-ridin' a wagon carryin' a grist of meal, pulled by a blaze-faced horse with burrs in his tail. He were totin' a keg of strained honey in his lap, and a woman was sittin' behind him with a spinning wheel onto her hip. The mare run square into the millin' expedition. Just as she did it, Stilliards hollered, "Yow, cut the bark," but he never added the K to that word to say bark, for something happened just then and thereabouts. Sut scratched his head and seemed to be in deep thought. "Well, Sut, go on," I said. "Well, I were just a-studyin' how to give you a sort of idea of how things looked after them two horse beasts mixed. S'pose you take a common-sized closed truck wagon, sort of old and rotten, with all the truck generally inside. Sit it down square into a railroad track, just so, and do it just in time for the train a-comin' 40 miles an hour, and their whistle string broke. How do you say things would look about a minute afterwards?" said Sut. Very much injured, I'd say," says I. "And powerful mixed?" Sut asked. "Yes," says I. "And tremendously scattered?" Sut asked. "Yes." "And awfully changed in shape?" "Yes." "And in value?" "Yes." "And a heap more pieces?" "Yes." "And smaller ones, too?" "Yes." "Splinters and scraps predominant?" "Yes," says I. "And not worth a dern by $1.50? "Yes." "Well," says Sut, "you can sorter take in the tremendous idea of that spot of sandy road where Lawyer Stilliards met the bald-headed man. That unlucky old baldy cuss lit 20 foot out into the woods, never looked back, pulled his wagon brakes real hard, and flew hisself somewhere out of the wagon toward the Black Oak Ridge. The woman hung by 1 foot in the fork of a blackjack, and a-holdin' to a dogwood limb with her hands, and she hollerin' sort of spiteful-like, 'Split the blackjack or fetch a quilt,' she says. Nothing of the sort were done while I was there that I know of. Lawyer Stilliards were nigh to the other side of the road, flat unto his back, fainted comfortable, and quiet as a sick cow in a snowstorm, his arms and legs stretched till he looked like a big letter X. His hat were somewhere, and a boot somewhere else. His clothes were in strings like he'd been shot through a thorn thicket out of a canyon. His nose were a-bleedin', and his eyes were shot up, and his face were puckered like a wet sheepskin afore a hot fire. And he looked sort of like he'd been studying a deep plan to cheat somebody, and he'd missed. The valuable hound dog, that is, what were left of him after being dragged to death, was tangled up in the mare's hind legs. And the mare was laying on her side with her neck broke, with a spoke from the woman's spinning wheel a-sticking out of her side about a foot or so deep. The old bald-headed man from the other wagon were on his side, now and then lifting his head and taking a look at the surrounding desolation. The old time clock were a-leaning up against a tree, some bark rope still around it, with the door gone, the face smashed, but still true to what it thought was its duty, just banging away as regular as if it were at home, and I reckon it's at it yet. There were honey keg hoops, heads and staves, and spinning wheel spokes promiscuously scattered all about, and gristmeal sprinkled over everybody and everything. Just then a feller what looked like he might be a tract sower or a map agent rode up and took a big look all around. Says he, "Mister, did the lightning hurt you?" Says I, "Wasn't lightning. A powder mill busted." The woman in the blackjack hollered at him just then, savage as a cat. "Look the other way, you cussed impudent hound!" The feller had to turn his head to see where the voice come from. He just looked on, squinted, and said, "Great heavens," and gave his horse an awful dose of whip and spurs, and left a-flying, and he told at town what he'd seen. The feller were awful scared, and no wonder. He'd seed enough to scare a sawmill plumb off the creek. I now took the meal bag, put in the remnant of the dog, and such of the honey as I could scoop up, and drawed it over Lawyer Stillyard's head, tied it tight around his neck in hopes it might help him fetch it home sooner, split the blackjack, and left in a gallop. I took the road that Lawyer Stillyard's and the mare and his other gear had come over so far, and passed a cabin where an old woman smoking a pipe and dressed in a striped apron were standing on the ash hopper looking up the road like she were expecting to see something soon. Says she, talking about as fast as a fluttermill, "Say you, mister, did you meet anything on coming up there?" I shook my head. "Well," says she, jumping off the hopper and shaking the ashes out of her coat tail and setting her spectacles down her nose, "Mister, I'm plumb outdone. There's something powerful wicked going on. A crazy organ grinder come a-past here just a small scrimshin slower than chain lightning, and a horse with no tail. His organ were tied onto his back, and were a-playin' that good tune Sugar in the Gourd or Barbary Allen, I don't know which, and his monkey were a-dancin' Hail Columbia all over the road, and its tail were as long as my clothesline, and perfectly bare of hair. The organ grinder had no hat on, and one of his boots flew off as he passed here and lit on the smokehouse. There it is. He must have been a powerful big man, for it's like unto an indigo saroon, or a bale of indigo covered with leather." All this were said without taking one breath. I told her it were the advance guard of a big circus proclaiming its coming, or the millennium, and durned if I knowed which. She bellowed it couldn't be the millennium, for it weren't playing hymn tunes. Nor a circus either, for the horse wasn't spotted. But it might be the devil after a tax collector or a missionary on his way to China. It looked ugly enough to be one, and fool enough to be the other. She were powerfully exercised. She sweat and snorted on it. Now don't you believe, as soon as Lawyer Stillyard's come to and got out of the bag, he set in and buried the mare so as to hit her. And then, at next court, he indicted me for stealing her, and darn nigh proved it. Now ain't that the devil?" "Well, whatever became of Stillyard, Sut, anyhow?" I asked. "I don't know," says Sut. "If he ain't in Congress, he's down in hell somewheres." And that concludes George Harris's 1867 Sut Lovingood story called The Widow McCloud's Mare. Lawyers are fun to make fun of. However, in defense of my profession, there are many types of lawyers. And besides, lawyers don't sue people. People sue people. This is John T. Rhapsodies Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please help me earn the warm embrace of Mr. and Mrs. YouTubes, who look with loving favor upon those channels whose listeners faithfully subscribe, like, comment, click the notification bell, and share the videos with their friends, so that they too can hear the words of old.